I was staring at the wonderful blue Mediterranean about a week ago, and I was thinking, what am I going to talk to you about? So you see, you're always in my thoughts. As you know, this session and next one was supposed to be on China, Asia, and the other one on Africa, and I hadn't firmly decided which to do first. And I decided 3 days ago, I think, I'll do Africa today, because I think you're so in the mug of today that anything dealing with the here and now is just more depressing, and so it's useful to talk about depressing things down the line rather than here and now. But before I do so, I do want to comment on something totally different, which we can also discuss in questions and answers, and that is the latest mess with the Kurds and Syria and Turkey. I mean, the impeachment stuff is bopping along, and there's all kinds of news today about it, and blah, blah, blah. But this is like serious international stuff. It's interesting that those who oppose, you know what I'm talking about, right? Trump decided we're out of there. And by being out of there, he means the figures are hard to come by. It's 1,000 or 2,000 Americans who are out there in Kurdish, Syria, whatever. And he just wants to pull them out quickly, against the advice of the State Department, the Defense Department, and God knows, even the Republicans. Now, what's useful to see here is that people who oppose his actions oppose it on 3 grounds, and they're different people opposing it on different grounds. The Republicans are opposing it on fear that ISIS will resurrect, by and large. The people who oppose moving them out are also some progressives are thinking, well, actually, not opposing, actually, he might be right, because we're sick and tired of military intervention everywhere. So he even gets some support from people who are normally very critical of him. And then on the other side of people who oppose him, there are those people, quite aside from the whole ISIS re-emerging possibility, who are arguing against it on moral and ethical grounds, which are, we ask people to support and to work for us, and to, in a sense, lay their lives on the line, like the Kurds, who have essentially done all the hard work while we've been directing them. And then we're saying, well, you guys are on your own, forget about it. We have some other fish to fry, and, if you get wiped out by Turkey in the process, that's not our problem. You all settle it. So there is a serious moral, ethical question here, not so much, on the one hand, why we get involved in Vietnam and Iraq and all those places, but there's also an ethical question as when we leave, how we leave. And it seems to me in the long term, that ethical question that everybody is looking at, by that I mean our allies and so forth, is as important as the more detailed aspects of what to do about the ISIS fighters and so forth. So I think this is a serious foreign policy blunder, if I can call that, as we've had in a long time. And it's whether or not it registers with Trump supporters, who knows? The explanation, of course, that I promised that we would get out of all our international involvement, he is just consistent. He's saying, well, now I'm doing it, right? You elected me to do it. Now I'm getting out. And as I said, liberal and progressives think, go for it, guy, in some ways, because we don't want to be, screwing around in various places. But of course, with everything that Trump does, it's an announcement, and then there's a slight unraveling. And so between yesterday and today, he's already tweeted to say, well, if the Turks go after the Kurds and do harm out there or release the ISIS people, I'm going to do Turkey in. I will ruin Turkey. I will destroy its economy. So, and finally, I'm not going to talk about this for the rest of the hour, but just by way of introduction to maybe later in discussion. On the other hand, of course, this business of some authoritarian leader calling Trump and him deciding on the telephone that he is going to put himself in league with him is not unusual, right? He's done that in various parts, and Erdogan by now is an authoritarian leader, and so they get on the phone and they say, well, let's move ahead with this. Needless to say, Turkey has a very different agenda, and the agenda for Turkey is, we want to get rid of the Kurds, and of course, the Kurds are sprawled around the region, right? They're once in Syria, they're once in Turkey, they're once in Iraq, and so forth, and it's the Kurds essentially who've done much of the bidding for the U.S. in Iraq and in Syria and so forth. And we're not just talking about a few Kurds who are minding the camps that the ISIS people are in. We're dealing with Kurds who essentially are based and are Syrians in a whole section of northern Syria. So you're pulling, in order for Turkey to be able to say it safeguards itself against terrorists coming from the Kurds in Turkey and along the border, it essentially is willing to sell out the Kurdish community in Syria and let the Syrians do whatever they want to do with the Kurds. So this has not only serious human rights implications for those that have been helping the U.S. monitor the ISIS people and in effect shrink and take the ISIS land away from them and so forth. But it is in fact a testimony that we as Americans, on behalf of our president, couldn't care less about the millions of Kurds in Syria and what their rights might be that we have been claiming to defend. So this is serious on so many levels that it's worth paying some attention to. Okay, so the reason I want to talk about Africa is because Africa of the future is very serious, if not in our lives, in our children's and grandchildren's lives. And it's not much in the news nowadays, so it seems kind of esoteric, and it will take us out of thinking about, all the daily news. So I hate to do facts and figures here, but let me give you a few. As we speak, the UN and the World Bank and so forth say that there are 1.3 billion Africans, and those 1.3 billion Africans constitute 17% of all humans in the world. By 1950, they anticipate 2.5 billion Africans, which will make up 26% of the world's population. And by the end of the century, they anticipate 4.5 billion people, which will constitute 40% of all humans on this globe. We're talking serious population shifts and situations here. Now, as it happens, I don't believe most of these statistics because long-term demographic statistics are by and large not very accurate, number one. Number two, all kinds of things happen that undermine or change the growth rate of populations. Fertility declines for a variety of reasons. You can have a plague, you can get more affluent, then people have fewer children, more people move into urban areas, they tend to have few children and so forth. So one can play around with these statistics, but it gives you some proportion of things out there. The other thing about statistics about African populations is they're entirely based on what one UN official 50 years ago said to me, all statistics pertaining to Africa are based on inspired guesses. Which is literally true. There are no census in those countries. That is to say, there is a kind of, do we know exactly how many people live somewhere in an African country? No. How do they guess? That's a good question. Generally speaking, they, for example, fly over villages and count the number of huts and determine, based on normal family size, how many people might be living there. That's roughly speaking how rural censuses are taken in Africa. Urban censuses are slightly better. And of course, Africa has 50-odd countries. That includes North and Sub-Saharan Africa. And they have varying kinds of size population. Nigeria, people think, has about 200 million right now. Ethiopia, maybe 115 million. The Congo, maybe 86 million. South Africa, maybe 58 million. That's probably more accurate. Tanzania, which used to be a tiny little country of 9 million people, now has 58 million, and so on down the line, right? Now, just before I get to substance, let me also say that when people put out these statistics, they also indicate what the median age is in people in these countries. And the median age, not in every country, but in most countries, most of the sub-Saharan countries, the northern tier countries, people's median age is somewhat higher, is sort of 18, 19, 20 years old. That's the median age, right? So if you have that young a population and you imagine everybody just replacing themselves, having 2 children, you can see how the population would grow, right? But most people in most African countries have 3-point-something and 4-point-something children right now. And that's how you get the population explosions. So under the best of circumstances, the population growth on that continent is a problem for each of the countries and is a problem worldwide. Under most estimates in the world, you have something like 28% of the population in many countries now living in urban areas. Within the next 25 years, the anticipation is that 40 to 50% of everybody in these countries will live in urban areas. Urban areas on the African continent are by and large a total mess. No housing regulations, no sewage systems, no transportation, no pollution control, nothing in particular of the infrastructure you would need to really grow cities and communities, right? So how many of you have been to Africa somewhere? Lots of you. You've probably been on safaris, right? And you've seen the nice animals and whatnot and so forth. Important things to look at because they're going away slowly. But you probably landed in Dar es Salaam or Nairobi or someplace and then fanned out to your safari. And those cities, on the whole, look presentable in the sense that wherever your hotel was seems okay. It's got a Starbucks somewhere down the street, and so forth. If you went a little further afield, you probably saw there were slums, especially in Nairobi. Some of you might have gone further afield and seen horrendous slums out there. But those are places where there are tourists. In some of the countries that have less tourism and therefore fewer hotels and investments and so forth, what you have is just urban sprawl and nightmare with a few 4 or 5-star hotels, but absolutely no functioning infrastructure whatsoever. Try the Congo sometime or something like that, and it looks entirely different. So there is a gradation and a variation of the affluence in countries and the infrastructure. But by and large, sub-Saharan African countries are ill-prepared without huge investments for large-scale urbanization. Now, why would a rational person living in the countryside in Nigeria, let's say, where it's, reasonably pleasant, people are poor, but it's reasonably pleasant, want to go to Lagos, which is one of the most unpleasant urban areas in the world, okay? Well, if you were 16, 17, 18, 19, and you were living out there, you have no way to make a living. And why don't you have to make a living when your father did and your grandfather did? So here we deal with land ownership, production, economy. By and large, I'm generalizing, rural Africans owned their land. By and large, there were also, large-scale foreign-owned and so forth, but by and large, most farmers owned their land, and if they didn't own their land, they, in sort of perpetuity, lived on the land, farmed the land, and so forth. And when they had children, that land would be divided amongst their children. So if you have a couple of sons, those sons, let's say you have 10 acres, each get 5 acres. If you have 4 sons, each son gets 2.5 acres. If you have 5 sons, they get less than 2 acres, and so on down the line. So that as population grew, in terms of fertility rates, the number of children people had, there was less and less viability on the land to sustain people based on historical ways of handing over the land. And so the urbanization process in Africa started getting very serious in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as more and more rural people had felt they needed to work in the urban areas. They needed even, standing on a street corner and, selling secondhand shoes was better than being in the rural area where your family farm could no longer support you. Now, you could say, well, weren't there better seeds and more irrigation and so forth to improve things? Yes, there were some of those things, but not fast enough to deal with the growth rate out there. And that is before you get to climate change. Because the 2 major confrontations of change in Africa are 1, population growth, and B, climate change. Much of the land in Africa, which used to be hospitable to agriculture, to fishing, to productive land and rural activity, has ceased to exist. If you look at a map sometime, you can Google it, of, let's say, water on the African continent. If you look at, let's say, 20 years ago, look for Lake Chad, which is sort of in the middle of West Africa. It was a huge lake. It supported lots of people fishing and supported their food, supported their economic activity. Lake Chad, which was this big on the map, is now this little on the map. And that is true of almost all the waterways in Africa. Part of that is climate change, large part, and part of it is also draining and, needed water supply and all that goes with it. So that not only is it getting hotter, but also it is making the rural sector in Africa unviable for a large chunk of the African population. And that explains 2 things. One that I've already mentioned, urbanization, and the other, people traipsing across the Sahara and risking their lives to get to Europe or anywhere because their situation is hopeless. If you live in the country of Mali, another West African country, I know you should have had maps, but whatever. Look at it home. If you look at a country like Mali, let's say, or Chad, or any of those countries in the Sahara region of West Africa, you can see to what degree, A, population growth rate has kicked in very serious ways. B, climate change has kicked in, right? And the age group, the demographics that I already mentioned has kicked in. And you say to yourself, well, I'd just as soon stay in Mali, but God knows I better go to Italy or someplace. It's not that people love going to Italy and leaving their homes and leaving their families from Nigeria or Chad or those places. It's the hopelessness of their situation which drives it. And as you know from reading the papers, there are hundreds of thousands of people risking their lives to get overseas anywhere, get in anywhere, sell, phony handbags on the streets of Rome or anything. Not because they're crazy, but because their situation at home is hopeless. And of course, we've talked about immigration in different contexts. Generally speaking, the people that leave are the most ambitious and able-bodied people who theoretically would make the best immigrants, right? Because they're willing to take the risk of breaking with their culture and their families and everything to make a better life for themselves and to somehow put roots down somewhere. And very often, of course, to also send money back home, which makes it viable for their sisters and brothers to somehow sustain themselves, right? We know this from the Philippines economy, which is supported 25%, I think, of the Philippine economy, is based on money made somewhere else by Filipinos sent back home, right? It's a larger and larger proportion of the economy. Sometimes a combination of climate change and demographics leads people to simply move to a different country in Africa where they think the situation might be slightly more advantageous. So that is another reason people move. Generally speaking, they come to grief in those countries. If you've been reading the paper in the last year, you know that there have been serious violent attacks against Zimbabweans in South Africa. The Zimbabwean situation is hopeless because of demographics, because of climate change, but also because of government corruption, violence, and so forth. So people say, okay, I might have a chance of employment and surviving if I go to South Africa or Botswana or Lesotho or one of those countries down there. They go down there, and then they're viewed with as much as hostility that Europeans view Africans and Americans increasingly view Hispanics and Central Americans, and they're in trouble of all kinds, right? So that's not a way out, but it shows you some of the hopelessness. Okay, I've mentioned climate change, I've mentioned demographic. The third thing that's happening, but in part because of the first two, is that most African governments are very badly governed, and many of them have civil conflicts and violence. Because when you have an incompetent, corrupt government, right, things are not fun in your country, right? But the corrupt and violent governments on the African continent are also play into the ethnic conflicts of African countries, which tend to be multi-ethnic. Now, why are they multi-ethnic? They're multi-ethnic because when the colonizers came along and drew lines around territories at a conference in Berlin in the late 19th century, they didn't care whether they split up people or which people were confined in a colony of one kind or another. And while it is fairly demonstrable, not 100%, but fairly demonstrable, that centuries ago, these different ethnic groups lived perfectly peaceful, or mostly perfectly peaceful with each other, in a situation of stress, and in a situation where the colonizers gave preference to one ethnic group over another, and then in a situation of limited resources for economic well-being and corrupt governments who favor their own ethnic group, you can understand where potential ethnic conflict becomes real ethnic conflict. So in addition to demography and climate change, you have bad governance and conflict. And conflict is then, in addition to climate change and demography, is the third leg, so to speak, of why it is that people leave. Because if you have violence and ethnic conflict in your country, and you think you and your family are going to lose their lives, you better believe you're going to try to go somewhere else to rescue yourself. So some of the people who leave don't just leave in rural areas where they can make a living, or because their land has dried up because there's no rain or access to water, but rather because the ethnic conflict is going to get them, they believe, and they better get out of there to help themselves. So I guess I'm not saying the desire for people to leave, and or, if you want to put the other way, people's perception that they can't stay put because their life is no longer viable, is all due to one cause. It might be multiple causes. I'm just trying to identify the three major causes here, and sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they don't overlap. It's worth just an asterisk here to say that some of the countries that have been most generous in adopting refugees from conflict in African countries and climate refugees and demographic refugees have actually been African countries. It hasn't been Europe. It hasn't been the United States. It's been other African countries. A country we read a lot of bad stuff about is Uganda, Idi Amin, right, and all of that. And now for the last 25, 30 years, another dictator, all kinds of bad things happening in Uganda. But in Uganda, you can come from the southern Sudan or anywhere else, and you can just walk in, and they give you some training if you need it, or if it's available. They give you some land. They don't harass you. They don't make you become a Ugandan. They just treat you in a civil way and saying, whatever, come. And so millions of African refugees live in Uganda. Tanzania used to be very hospitable to refugees coming in and just saying, well, it's our obligation to allow people to come in. Now, one of the problems, of course, for people moving, whether it's to another African country or moving to somewhere else, if you move to Europe somewhere, you're always going to be African, right? I mean, an Italian can't tell whether somebody is a Nigerian or Ghanaian. They're just an African, right? But you're certainly not going to be thought of as Italian. No way. You're not Italian. You're African. So that's that part. If you stay in Africa, of course, you can swish out of your ethnic group because ethnic groups often look very rigid in civil wars, but actually are really quite fungible. Historically, people married outside of their ethnic groups all the time in Africa. Somebody from one ethnic group met a woman from another ethnic group, or there weren't enough women in his village, and they just married people from a different village, and they were a different ethnic group. So it's a whole ton of ethnic mixing on the African continent. And of course, if you are a Sudanese, let's say, refugee in Uganda, you might want to go back to the Sudan if things became more viable or peaceful in the southern Sudan. But by the same token, by the time you can go back, you might have married some Ugandan, and that's sort of a mix. You then become sort of Ugandan. And somebody will say, well, you don't really look exactly Ugandan. Where are you from? And you say, oh, well, my mother or father or whatever was Sudanese. Oh, that explains it. Because people, of course, they're just not undifferentiable black. They are, in fact, identifiable by ethnic group. Now, we can't necessarily do that. That is to say, an American going to, let's say, meeting 10 Africans won't be able to say, gee, that person looks Ghanaian and that person looks, Nigerian, Yoruba or something. But certainly within Africa, people are able to tell, just the way that people in this country will say, gee, do you have Italian ancestry? You sort of look Italian. Or do you have Scandinavian ancestry? You sort of look Scandinavian. So those kinds of distinctions are also viable on the African continent. So this all by way of background, I suppose, and you might want to poke around that some more. What is happening on the African continent that is worth taking note of, that is of an economic, political, and social nature that is not produced by internal conflicts, climate change on the African continent, and the other things I talked about. Well, one of them, of course, is that Africa is not isolated. It trades. It's not just that it tries people rummage from there overseas. There's a lot of trade and there's a lot of investment on the African continent. So Africa is part of the globalization that we've talked about in other contexts. By looking the American press, you have the feeling very often that there's not much going on in Africa that's part of globalization. But that's absolutely untrue. And so let me try not to, cover tons of things, but just a few things. It used to be that most of the trade in Africa was external, on the one hand, to Europe, right? The colonies, the trade patterns. What kind of trade? Primary products to Europe, cocoa, palm oil, all the rest of it. And the criticism used to be made that those products didn't net very much income for Africans because the production and reproduction of those raw materials into coffee we can actually drink, like roasting it and all the rest, or the oil and packaging it, or the refinement of sugar or whatever, was made somewhere else, and the value added of the manufacturing part of those raw materials is what made the money, and therefore the colonizers made the money rather than the African countries, right? They had low income from those primary products, and the rest of the industrial world made a lot of money of it. That was certainly true in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I suppose it's still partially true. But somewhere along the line, through foreign aid and UN and other preachings, increasingly Africa was able to get into the second rung of reproducing the raw materials so that they could make more money of it. So let me give you an illustration having to do with cotton. So in parts of Africa, the Sudan and so forth, they grew a lot of cotton. The cotton was harvested, and then the cotton was sent to Holland or Indonesia or someplace where textiles were produced, and then it would be sent, let's say it was sent to Indonesia, and they produced the textiles, and then the textiles needed to be made into the patterns of cloth that we would buy or other people would buy, and it would be sent to Holland, and they would print the patterns on the cloth, and then it would be sold as African cloth, right? So you usually went to two or three industrial countries for production. So Africans got the message that the first line of defense, that is to say, creating, not only picking the cotton, but creating cloth, even though all of it might not have been printed in Africa, was already a way to make more money. So increasingly, Africans in the last 20 years, African countries in the last 20 years, got the capacity to use their raw and produce their raw material, but also gain some from the manufacturing part of the raw materials. So things got slightly better. Still, the trade from the continent was based on, by and large, on the raw material, and then let me hasten to add that also had meant oil, petroleum, because Nigeria and the Sudan and other places are major oil-producing countries, right? So as the international economic system required more petroleum, their petroleum became more desired, wanted, needed, and so the countries that had that as a raw material, not agricultural goods, but rather extractive goods, those extractive goods started making a lot of money. The problem with that was that the companies that owned the extractive goods were by and large not the African countries, but the companies, Shell, BP, and so forth. And yes, the African countries like Nigeria got a cut, but much of the African money made off of the Nigerian petroleum was in fact made by the petroleum companies. Well, that didn't seem like a very fair system. And let's say, American progressives argued, this is all wrong, this is very bad, African countries should get a bigger cut. And as you moved into the 80s and 90s, use Nigeria again as an example, Nigeria, in fact, got a bigger cut out of its natural resources, out of petroleum. The trouble was that the corrupt government got the cut, rather than it being reinvested in the society. So the raw materials, oil, in the case of the Congo, minerals, for example, the Congo, just to throw out a random, is, along with China, one of the two countries that produces rare earth, and rare earth is needed for all our iPhones, right, and laptops and so forth. So increasingly mining in countries of one kind or another helped, let's say, about maybe 10 countries have a product that was a non-agricultural product that was needed. But much of the profits were skimmed off by politicians in those countries. So that's one of the things that happened. But then increasingly a middle class developed in some of those countries, and it became, sizable. I mean, you go to Nairobi, let's say, again, and you see a sizable middle class roaming around, eating in the same restaurants you were eating in, and driving nice cars, and so on. That middle class wanted middle class products. They want TVs and refrigerators and cell phones and all of those kinds of things. So as a middle class developed with some resources in all African countries, but in larger numbers in some countries rather than others, we can talk about that, you began to have international trade pick up that wasn't one-way trade of primary products going out, but rather became back and forth trades of high-tech products coming in, primary products going out, and countries wanting to invest in trade in Africa that were non-colonial countries. And at the forefront of that, especially as we speak, is China. Right? China decided early on that you had a huge multi-billion person market in Africa, and this is a good market for Chinese products. By the same token, Africa is a good source for raw materials as long as they last or the climate allows it. For China, which often has a need for raw materials of one kind or another. China, as you know, has very little arable land, right? So they can use somebody else's arable land if it exists. But the trouble with trade of any kind and investment historically, since independence, before independence, is that it's very costly to trade with Africa because contemporary trade requires roads, railways, communication systems, roads where the trucks that load something on arrive in port when the ship is actually there rather than when the ship is left. You can't, manufacturing of any kind or semi-manufacturing of any kind requires electric supply, which isn't very good in a country that only has 3 or 4 hours a day of electricity, or where the electricity goes off in the middle of the day, and so forth. So the United States and some European investors and so forth constantly trade with Africa. It's too expensive. It's not worthwhile. Let's cultivate, I keep moving away, let's cultivate Latin America and other places. This is too costly. And the Chinese decided, no, actually, as a long-term investment, this is the right way to go. So the Chinese, as part of their Road and Band project, decided massive investments in African infrastructure, roads, railways, and so forth, before you even get in the business of actual trade. And they give loans to do these things. and they sometimes subsidize and give aid, but mostly it's loans. And so what happens is that African leaders who get a cut from all of this say, yeah, come in, let's have a railroad, let's have roads, let's have better ports, let's have all those things to help our economy. And they welcome them in. And the next thing you know, countries get incredibly indebted to China. Mozambique, which did fairly well for a while, is now so indebted to China that even the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, can't figure out a way to dig it out, right? Because the government said, yeah, come in, do this, do that, we'll take a loan, we'll take this loan, we'll take that loan. And now, China says, well, you got to start repaying. And the economy isn't growing fast enough, we're not earning fast enough. And so this is a double-edged sword for all countries. That includes, Sri Lanka and other countries that they're rummaging through. But it is an absolutely potentially life-saving on the one hand and disastrous on the other hand for a continent that is as underdeveloped in its infrastructure as the African continent is. All right. So then you say, well, all right, so China, what about other countries? Well, India and Indonesia are part of the ball game here. And India and Indonesia are saying, China, they're the big guys, they're arrogant, they think they know what we're doing, but they're already so developed that they don't really understand you and your level of development. But we in Indonesia and we in India, we're closer to your level. So listen to us and do what we say and use our investments and so on. Because actually, we will help you from primary products to the next stage, and that will help a lot. So you oddly have major investors in the especially in sub-Saharan Africa, of India and Indonesia moving in at ever bigger numbers. So what used to be a European ball game, which the U.S. then entered after independence and in the heyday of U.S. investments in aid, has increasingly morphed in the last decade to China, India, Indonesia. There's some others. I mean, Japan plays a role, and we can talk about others. But those are the main players out there. Where is this all going to lead? Well, it can't lead anywhere very easily in terms of climate change, because those countries themselves have serious climate change issues, and it's a global issue. It can't very easily deal with the demographics, although I think the UN, I myself think, this is just an opinion, that the UN undermines or doesn't reconcile the degree to which, as people become slightly more affluent.
I'm sorry to bother you. We need to make an announcement. Somebody in a black Toyota Corolla is blocking the access up above, and you need to move your car. 8CYF 975.
Thank you. To say, well, they can't do anything about the demographics. Well, you can't do anything about the demographics in the short term, but you can, as people become more middle class and affluent, the fertility rate goes down, right? So I think it's foolhardy to say that investments and economic growth in urban areas will have no impact at all on the demographics. Now here I hasten to add something we've talked about before, but some of you may not have been here. There is a difference, one needs to understand the difference between fertility rate and population growth rate. Fertility rate are the number of children that a woman of childbearing age has in her lifetime statistically. Growth rate has to do with the number of additional people a society adds. If you go back to my numbers of how young the population is, you can see that even if you bring down the fertility rate of those people, that is to say they decide to only have 2.6 children rather than 3.6 or 4.6, it will take a long time for the population growth rate to actually slow down. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's a big, yes, I think increasing middle-class development on the African continent will slow down the fertility rate, but in this century, it will, to some extent, will not radically slow down the population growth rate. Okay, so the growth rate and its impact on land, the environment, resources, and so forth will continue. There are lots of other things to say about this, but let me then say all we ever hear about Africa, including what I've just been saying, makes it seem like very bad, very negative, very hopeless, and so forth. At the same time that all of this stuff is going on, it is one of the continents which is doing incredibly interesting things, innovative things in technology. That is a contradiction. You wouldn't believe that in the country of Rwanda, they have a zip line delivery system which zips blood and other needs of hospitals in rural Rwanda within minutes of the hospital expressing the need for those hospital, whatever, blood or plasma or whatever, and it goes by zip line, and which swings a drone into the air, and the drone lands at that hospital, and that hospital takes the stuff and takes it to the doctor and puts the drone back onto the zip line, which then the drone sails back off. I mean, we don't have things like that. And they do. And that sort of delivery by drones of blood has been going on in the country of Malawi, which is one of the more backward countries in Africa, for almost a decade. Right? 80% or so of every Kenyan has a cell phone access. I don't know what it's in the US, but 80% have access. And furthermore, they know to do with cell phones things we don't know how to do. Because they have skipped a whole decades of technology. They have never, rural people earning little money bringing their products to market, have never had a banking account, have never had a safe place to put their money, have never had any of the facilities to handle financial stuff. They now have online banking, which they never see money. It all is on their cell phones. And some of you know lots more technology than I do. But it has skipped past where we are. I mean, we have some of those facilities, but we're still using money and cash. They don't. They haven't seen cash in years out there, right? And they've overcome that. There are experiments in African schools with everybody having laptops. It turns out that's not so good educationally, but in any event, they were provided laptops. And then you say to yourself, that's insane. I'm reading in the paper that a whole school in rural somewhere in Africa, the little kiddies in elementary school are using laptops. They don't have books. Well, to begin with, of course, they never had books. So laptop skips the book part and the paper part, right? And the pencil part. But then the laptops, after all, have to be recharged. Well, where the hell do you do that? Right? In villages that have no electricity. Right? So, Swedish company gets in there and they help several governments develop just little solar panels to put on huts, which aren't enough to do very much of anything except to recharge the phone and the laptop. Right? And maybe an hour of electricity, and that system is getting better. So, I mean, I could go on for, 20 minutes of all the various innovations that are tried somewhere. We're all worried about water shortage. Well, water shortage in Santa Cruz is a joke compared to water shortages in many African countries. I mean, there is almost no water for some people. And it's not just in the most backward countries in Africa. Cape Town, which is one of the more developed cities in South Africa, if you recall, was it a year ago, 2 years ago, ran out of water. Right? So this is a serious issue. Well, all kinds of engineers and scientists and whatnot have been for several years working on this problem. And they haven't resolved it, but they're a good way up, which is to develop something that looks like a refrigerator, which is able to 100% recycle all water in a household. And I actually think that that's going to come to the US and other places as well. That is to say, you have this machine, and whether it's sewage or water use or whatever it is, it completely recycles it and safely so that a family unit can live on X gallons which constantly get recycled. Now, all right, so it's 10 years away, 15 years away, or whatever. But a combination of African scientists and engineers and so forth, with what? Money from external sources very often, and very often people who actually go to MIT to get their degrees and then go back home and help their own countries develop it. It is not true that every African who can get out of Africa leaves. There are a lot of young Africans with PhDs and MAs who decide to put shoulder to the wheel back in Africa. And that's, of course, much more preferable because they understand the social conditions and the cultures which will make some of these things work. Now, I'm not trying to paint a picture of all these little things that are happening out there are about to resolve the problems. What I am saying is that there is an awful lot of innovation going on to try to overcome some of these issues and try to overcome recycling water, different seeds to allow things to grow in less housing innovation of one kind or another, bringing reasonable. Let me just deviate. One of the reasons so many young people go to urban areas, not just to make a living, but also rural areas, are really boring. I mean, there's nothing going on. And now in the days of TV and so forth, you know that there's something going on somewhere else. So they want a little bit more excitement, a more interesting life, and so they want to also move into the urban areas. So providing cinema, TV, all kinds of things in the rural areas, lots of times keeps people in the rural areas because now it's gotten more interesting, right? So you don't absolutely have to leave, or everybody that doesn't want to leave anymore. So all of these kinds of the modernity and the context in which African peoples live has so fundamentally changed in the last 50 years, 10 years, 25 years, that to write off the continent and to sort of say, well, it's really all hopeless. You're going to have these billions of people out there, and they're all just going to die like flies, and nothing is happening, and we want to wash our hands of it all. So let me finally say that the country that most wants to wash its hands of Africa at the moment is the United States, which used to be one of the biggest donor countries in many African countries, wasted a lot of money in foreign aid. I am the first to say, because we as Americans, there's a little Trump in us all. America first, we're better, we're smarter, we're this, we're that. And so we wade into these countries without knowing anything about the culture or the local circumstance, and we waste tons of money and human resources. And, one can write the tragic history of American foreign aid in Africa and elsewhere over the last 50, 60 years. It's really easy to do. If you would like me to depress you, I can do that. So in a sense, we've done a lot of not very useful things. Ditto the United Nations and the other international institutions that have very often not used the funds and the technical assistance as well as they should. Nevertheless, having said all of that, for the U.S., the richest country in the world and so forth, to essentially pull out doesn't just mean that it shortchanges the capacity to improve health care, let's say, on the continent, which, by the way, is of our national interest and not just their interest. But it also means that we've essentially opted out of playing a role on the continent for the current situation and future situations. And that, of course, is one of the problems of U.S. foreign policy. By saying, well, we've overextended ourselves, Obama said the same thing, actually. We've overextended ourselves by mucking around everywhere. That's one side. But if you take it to the opposite extreme and say, as a major country and society and culture and so forth, we're essentially washing our hands of these people, also means that you no longer have any influence. And what I can tell you in the 1960s, when was the first time I went to Africa, there was a picture of J.F. Kennedy, God knows, in rural huts in Africa because people so idolized the U.S. and the rest of it. That kind of warmth. We weren't the colonial power in Africa. We were going to help people, we're going to help countries. We weren't scarred by colonialism and all the rest. That was a phase, and it was a phase which we could have taken advantage of and did for many years, and we've now completely thrown the towel in, more or less. Well, do you want your tax money to go to these messy countries in Africa? No, we need, we need roads, we need this, we need military, we need all the rest of it. The amount, when Americans are asked about how much of their tax money goes into foreign aid in any given year, they say, thousands. It's actually less than $5 a person, even during its height. So it was always a very small proportion of our budget and our wealth, right? And it made a huge difference for a long time in so far as keeping the Russian influence at bay, keeping some of the colonial bad habits at bay, and so forth. And we've essentially lost that influence, not just in Africa, in other parts of the world as well. And of course, who's jumped in? China has jumped in. Right? Now, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. But here's the here's the rub with U.S. and China. In the case of the U.S., it was known to Africans what our domestic discriminatory policy to African Americans was. They knew about that. They had heard of Martin Luther King and all the rest. Okay. By the same token, they also surmised that we were not like the colonial power. And so we were welcome. When the Chinese first arrived in Africa, which was actually during the height of the Cold War, but the Tamzam Railroad, the railroad going from Zambia to the coast of Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, which was going to help trade with the rest of the world, was built by the Chinese, right? And the Chinese have built, in those days, 60s, 70s, built all kinds of infrastructure in Ethiopia, by the way. And after the thing was built, the Chinese, well, to begin with, the Chinese imported the labor to build these things. They didn't use Africans. So that wasn't very popular. In countries where there's underemployment, right, you would hope your locals get employed. In fact, the Chinese flew in hundreds and thousands of Chinese. They built the thing, everything was fine, then they left. Okay. In Ethiopia, sort of similar things. But the Chinese, if anything, are as racist as we are, if not more so. And they actually think of Africans as being sort of inferior humans, as categories. So the Chinese don't care in terms of investment and trade because they're going to leave, right? And so instead of, while they were there building these things, consuming local products, integrating with the local population, the Chinese essentially built compounds, grew their own vegetables, raised their own pigs, told their workers not to mix with the local population, and pretty soon the local population didn't like the Chinese a lot. So, for example, in the 70s, the Ethiopians kicked the Chinese out. They're back now, but they kicked them out because they really hated the Chinese, right? So the Chinese are not necessarily traders and investors who develop warm relationships with Africans because they tend to stay by themselves and discriminate against the local population. Having said this, one more asterisk before I give you the break, and that is about 1 million Chinese, not representing the government, have decided to settle in Africa. So now you have a pretty big African presence in China. People got sick of China for one reason or another, or didn't have opportunities. And while they were there working for some project, they thought, gee, this neighborhood could use a little sort of 7-Eleven type store. And why don't I move myself and my family and open one of these? And gee, these people need a recharging station for their cell phones. So why don't I provide that service for some minimal fee? And gee, there's a shortage of some kind of food store down there. And gee, where do these people buy their shoes? Well, maybe we could open a little shoe store here. And lo and behold, all over the African continent, more or less, not everybody equally, you have all kinds of Chinese running the sort of places that we are used to being run by, let's say, Koreans in New York, right? Corner shops doing this, that, and the other thing. Now, are these people personally popular? Not necessarily. Are they intermarrying with Africans? Not necessarily. But they are a counterweight to the role of China is playing in Africa. So on the one hand, you have these huge investments and huge numbers of Chinese coming for investments and building these things and running them very often. And on the other hand, you increasingly have a Chinese settler population on the African continent. It's an understudied subject. Nobody has written, as far as I know, a PhD thesis about this as yet, but it's an interesting kind of development. So you move from colonialism to American massive influence with some Russian influence in particular states, socialist, communist countries. You then have a phase out of the colonials, not entirely, they're still around in the countries that used to be their colonies. Then you have now a phase-in of Chinese, Indians, Indonesians. And of course you've had Indians in Africa for a long time. They were settlers, they lived there. That's a separate topic we might discuss during discussion. But you have a different category of Indians now, which are investors and small business people re-emerging. Break time. All right, fire away. Yes?
Can you speak about the exploitation of minerals and also about public health and diseases?
Oh, those are two little minor topics. Not much to be said about either. Okay, exploitation of minerals. Minerals have always been exploited on the African continent, whether it was, copper or gold in South Africa, diamonds and so forth. they are exploited, continue to be exploited in lots of countries, and the exploitation is not entirely by the companies. Often it is by the reigning corrupt government that gets a big cut. There are some deviations from that. One is Botswana, which is always everybody's illustration for the one successful, democratic, nice, pleasant. Has anybody been in Botswana? Yes? Lovely country, right? Little country. Huh? Yes, there's a detective series about Botswana. Small country, a couple million people. Run from the very beginning by a really good leader, and nowadays run by his son, who is less of a good leader, and it looks like Botswana may be unraveling, but that's a separate issue. They had diamonds. They still have diamonds, and they are about the only country on the African continent where the diamonds were used to actually build that country up. So there is at least one illustration of that it can be done. And they've pretty much did it. And interesting, during the height of the AIDS crisis, moving to your health thing, there, I think it was a little less than 50% of the sort of educated male population, school teachers, government officials, and so forth, tested HIV positive. And there was the general idea that half the population of Botswana was just going to die. And who are going to be your school teachers if almost 90% of them were HIV positive? And because then things were discovered to keep people alive with HIV, and Botswana could not only get international aid, but could also afford it to set up clinics and testing and all the rest of it. All these people haven't died. So what seemed to be an almost devastating health crisis was rescued by international developments in medicine, but was also rescued by the fact that you had a really competent government who immediately jumped in, tested people, got people to be tested, and all the rest. So, exploitation in the Congo, exploitation in, the Sudan, Nigeria, every place. The exploitation, the reason I gave you the Botswana example is that the exploitation could be managed and to greater advantage of the local population if you didn't have as much corruption as you do. And, we look upon it and say, why are these countries so corrupt? But then now we live in a fairly corrupt country ourselves, I dare say. If there's Trump supporters here, I'm in difficulty. So corruption is relative, and I'm not saying each African country is corrupt as the next, but on the topic of mineral wealth and so forth, it is very easy to skim off, not just by the corporations, but by the local elite who then don't deploy what they could have. Is Africa rich in minerals? Some countries are and some countries aren't. And in some countries, the minerals wealth of the place hasn't even been exploited. So geologists may know that under the desert sand somewhere there's reason to believe there's X, but it hasn't actually been mined and exploited. So on the one hand, one can do a study of the minerals that are currently exploited and being used, and one can also add several chapters on the other potentials of one kind or another. So it's both a sad and a complicated issue. Healthcare, wait a second, he had a second part. Healthcare, it depends on the relative competence of the government, very often. varies greatly from country to country. Almost all African countries nowadays have a single major hospital of some kind that's very often in the capital, which is able to do serious surgery and so forth. The elite can go there. Sometimes rural people wind up there. The health care of the rest of the population is often minimal. And we saw this during the Ebola crisis, that the delivery systems and the testing was very difficult in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia because of the healthcare infrastructure. The healthcare infrastructure in countries like South Africa is pretty good. But here again, technology is coming to the rescue. There are quite a lot of countries, maybe 17, I don't know, which now have the key hospital, have the capacity for surgeons in the state-of-the-art surgeons in the urban hospitals to either themselves by remote control or through consultancy by remote control help in very complicated surgeries in the rural area. So the fact that you now have all this technology which allows surgeons to operate when they're not physically present and or to see exactly what the local people are doing and to direct their activity. So the health care in various African countries has been radically helped by the development of healthcare technology. And it's another case and point of Africa where Africa has been able to skip lots of intermediary technologies and move from where they are, which may be rural and very bad, to state-of-the-art, getting moved in through technology. And that's actually a very exciting subject and something that doctors of various kinds have begun to write about, Gumwali in the New Yorker and others, because it's exciting. It's exciting for doctors. It's exciting for the medical profession. I'm sorry, I didn't. Go ahead.
The actor George Clooney and his wife have done some work in Africa. I don't know where. Are there many people who are from the United States who are putting money into Africa aside from government?
Yes, are people other than governments from the United States putting money into Africa? Huh?
The Gates are.
Well, yeah. So there are foundations, which includes the Gates Foundation. They are. Gates, Clinton, all kinds of Rockefeller for years. Rockefeller and Ford were on the ground before anybody did anything. So lots of foundations put in lots of money. And then there are specialized organizations of one kind or another. For example, Doctors Without Borders. Many of you might be contributing to them, who do incredible work out there. It's an international institution, but certainly, it puts its shoulder to the wheel from Americans and American money and doctors and nurses and all the rest. So there are all kinds of charities of one kind or another. And then there are individuals of one kind or another, like the Clooneys that you mentioned, who themselves have, they may be primarily interested in human rights, right? And so you have human rights organizations of one kind or another. The human rights is complicated and is a topic we might just use as a topic sometime, because what's a human right? Is having 13 children a human right? Is getting Medicare care a human right? Is not being a victim of ethnic conflict a human right? Human right is a very broad and something I've occupationally occupied myself with all my career. It's a very complicated kind of subject, and people jump into it in different ways. We have, let me just give you a weird illustration. One of the ways of being in favor of women's rights. One of the ways of dealing with family size and so forth is, of course, family planning. And family planning means birth control, but it also means abortions in certain circumstances. So where does, let's say, the U.S. fit in there? Well, how do we discuss this in this country domestically? When we have periodically have presidents, Trump is not the first, who have absolutely banned assistance to rural and urban hospitals of anybody doing family planning who also does abortions, and or in certain cases when supported by evangelical groups and others, have absolutely opposed any family planning. And so we were supporting, let's say, a whole network of family planning clinics in country X in Africa. All of a sudden, the American president comes along and he says to the USAID and even private charities, no more money is going into that. Which is our current status of things. Not only USAID is not allowed to fund these things, but also we refuse to fund those aspects of the United Nations which is busy doing that. Right, so it depends on American oddity of American politics, but certainly for most African countries, women's access to family planning is a tool to prevent AIDS spreading, which is still doing to some extent in Africa, is also helping, population management, women's rights, and so forth. Very complicated business. So you have all those organizations, and if you consider that a part of human rights, it's, that's whole one chunk here, then the next chunk has to do with just general health. The next chunk has to do with violations of people's political and ethnic rights. And it's a huge operation. Yes, and there are groups. And yes, if you want to make a contribution, it's easy to find groups to support whatever your ideas are. Yes, sir?
Can you give us some kind of overview of some of these rebel groups that kidnap the women and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good question. Let me back into that question by saying, as we in the United States are pulling out of the world, right, and never mind mucking around everywhere, as it happens, we have little groups of Americans in almost 40 of the 50-odd African countries mucking around, trying to defeat various terrorist groups, wanting to control things here and there. You may remember how many months ago when a couple of American soldiers got killed in West Africa, right? They were on some kind of unknown expedition. First, we didn't own up to the fact that they were even there, and what were they doing there, and so forth. So while we are now standing proudly for not wanting to be involved in these countries, we have all kinds of creepy stuff going on in lots of these countries. Creepy is my editorial. Now, part of that, and I'm backing up into your question, is the fact that a lot of terrorist organizations which have, two types of terrorist organizations. One kind of terrorist organization which is like Boko Haram that you probably heard of, which is busy occupying itself in Nigeria. They're the ones that kidnapped the girls. They're also busy across the border in the Cameroons, which is right next door, in Niger, and all kinds of places. They are originally a local terrorist group trying to fight political forces in their own countries, right? Once you have a little terrorist group somewhere dealing with a domestic activity, whatever it is, it's not difficult for them to link up with other terrorist groups out there. And so Boko Haram, which was not particularly linked with ISIS, let's say, just to name two that you've heard of, ISIS comes along and saying, hey guys, we've really developed an organization, we can help you with this and that, and we'll send a few people. And so then you have other terrorist groups getting involved. You have terrorist groups throughout the Sahara, all the Saharan countries, all the West African countries. Some of them are localized, wanting to overthrow their government or to oust some ethnic group and put their ethnic group into power. Some of them are part of international networks like ISIS. And a lot of ISIS, just to speak of ISIS since it's a known thing for us, is that as they got kicked out of Iraq and difficulties in Syria and so forth, they spread out everywhere to continue their activities. And of course, they're funded in part by Pakistan, and all the rest of it. They're part of that network. Are they all aliens? No. A lot of them are native people that are recruited. Again, young chaps who have nothing better to do, unemployed, underemployed. Hey man, I can pay you $100. Let's go to a nightclub. Let's have a beer. Why don't you join us? I can provide you with a weapon. That sort of thing. So the recruitment in Africa of terrorists, of major international terrorist groups, as well as local groups, is very rapidly increasing and is a huge problem. What to do about it is hard to know. In many ways, the way to fight terrorism is to have a reasonable government and a government that is operational and so forth. But as things fall apart, terrorists fill the vacuums everywhere. So terrorism on the African continent, I would submit to you, is one of the major problems of the next decade. And how to deal with it is, your guess is as good as mine. It's a major mess. Yes?
I've heard of a company in New York City. I have someone who's been recruited to work there. It's a marketing company, and they're marketing to United States and European businesses and to African universities and training centers to bring technology to people who are engineers and as you were talking about before, to work across borders and they can even move to these various. So do you see something like that as sort of a brain drain from some of these highly educated people?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is a lot of international globalized activity in technology, as we know. Companies are globalized on the one hand. On the other hand, there are organizations, which sounds like what you're talking about, which are commercial organizations which nevertheless try to, move people around. Two things I think I want to say about that. All countries have some brain drain when things are not going well in the country and people have the potential to go somewhere else. And there was a period, just to bring it home, where there were, armies of Indians and Chinese and so forth who were coming to the United States, emigrating, so to speak, and were part of the brain drain for those countries. It's been notable in the last few years that a lot of Chinese and Indians have gone back to India and China as the circumstances there get better. So the brain drain may not be permanent. Second of all, by people moving around, let's say getting a degree at Caltech or MIT, working here for a few years, they pick up skills that then when they go back, they have a higher level of skills of one kind or another. It is incredibly foolhardy, the kind of visiting scholar immigration policy that we have right now, because while these people pick up technological know-how, which they can then deploy in their home countries, they also pick up how sort of Western democracy works, how things can be done differently and so forth. So they are more of an influence beyond their narrow technology when they go back home. So if you're asking me personally, I think people moving around the world is a very good thing. It would be a good thing more Americans walk around the world other than tourists. tourism is also good and helpful, but just people working a few years here, there, and yonder. And it used to be that the way we thought about, from an American perspective, is, well, we sent college graduates to go into the Peace Corps. And by the way, I'm not at all, was not ever anti-Peace Corps. It was a good thing while it was good. And among other things, the people who went into the Peace Corps, might have included some of you, were then the people who populated the U.S. AIDS agencies, the UN, and all the rest. Having once lived in a society like that, they became a lot more useful bureaucrats and civil servants. So just the exposure of living in rural sometime and seeing that those cultures are very different than your own made them much more useful at home than they would have been otherwise. So those kinds of institutions are fine, but beyond the sort of Peace Corps volunteer kind of work, and there are other volunteer organizations, the idea of companies employing people from other societies and then they move around, I think is an entirely good idea. Now, somebody who might be in the tech industry will immediately say, yeah, but when they're here, they steal from us. And they steal all our technology. Well, we steal from other people. Yes, they've stole from us. Some of you who are tech people might want to address this. But, when all is said and done, I am prejudiced. I am an internationalist. I believe in global stuff. And sometimes you lose something, but you might also gain something. But I want to just tell you my prejudice. There are other people who will say, no, you can't have these Chinese mucking around in Google because they'll steal us blind. Maybe. But at the end of the day, I think everybody who's worked in Google or everybody else, for a while, if they go back home, that's great. And if they don't get back home, it enriches our society. Because one of the things we underrate is the fact that in American engineering schools, for example, 80% of the people studying engineering are not Americans. So we wouldn't, in fact, have the engineers. And if you look at medicine, going back to your question, go look at American hospitals sometime, or look at rural hospitals sometime. You can hardly find a native-born American doctor. So we're the beneficiaries in many ways of those folks. And it is, we are a society built on immigrants, and God knows if immigrants are coming and developing skills which our society needs, why not have them? I say. But yes.
What do you think the efficacy and evolution of the African National Congress?
Big question. African National Congress was Nelson Mandela's party. It liberated South Africa from white control. Almost every organization in this world that anybody's ever talked to has had high points and then it disintegrates. And I'm afraid that the noble African National Congress, which some of the most heroic South Africans worked with, were imprisoned by the government because of their work with them, including Nelson Mandela, eventually became corrupt, which is what it is now. It's a corrupt organization. It's an organization which is not serving the people of South Africa or any people of South Africa very well. And it badly needs some really good leadership and, cleansing itself of the rot. But, who are we to say as Americans that some party should cleanse itself of the rot? It's in bad shape. And there are opposition parties and opposition leaders are coming to the fore. And, take somebody like Winnie Mandela, who was Nelson Mandela's wife, right? I mean, an absolutely heroic woman who had to endure her husband being in prison for most of their life. Eventually, she succumbed to corruption. Very sad. And, who are we to cast stones? I mean, who are you or I to know that under those circumstances we would not have cut deals or whatever? We'd like to think we wouldn't have, but a lot of creepy stuff going on there. Now, it should be said that Ramaphosa, who is the current head of the South African government, he came out of the labor union movement. He was South Africa's heroic labor union leader of the mining industry and whatnot as a young man. And he was the hope of the future of the lefty, radical South African future. And then in due course, he became a very affluent businessman. Very affluent, multimillionaire. By, enriching himself through hard work. I'm not saying it was necessarily corrupt, with deals with corporations and this and that. He set up businesses and all the rest of it. And in due course, he ran for prime minister and he won. He won even though there were conflicts in the African National Congress. There was a faction opposed to him. And he was the decent person who, just because he became rich didn't mean he was morally and otherwise corrupt, right? So there was a lot of, when he got elected, there was a lot of hope that he could clean up the corruption and mess in South Africa, which is at the moment is quite bad. And while he has been trying, he has not been terribly successful so far, so we shall see. I mean, he's still making an effort, and that wing of the African National Congress, his wing, was trying to, in a sense, clean up the party and get rid of, some of the rest of it, and say that one of the reasons many black South Africans are so unhappy in the post-independence period is because they have not realized any of the promises of betterment in education and economics, in anything. For those of you who've been to South Africa recently, I mean, I'm sure whoever you went with or whatever group you went with told you not to go out at night and not to run around with any money and so forth. Well, you could say the same thing about Chicago or New York, I suppose. But it should be said that Cape Town, which is this beautiful place on the water and has had some of the best race relations even during apartheid, has a decent university and all the rest, is one of the highest crime rates in the world right now. Right? And then you ask yourself why. Well, you ask yourself why because lots of teenagers and others who can't get employment, who are frustrated and so forth, are just taking life into their own hands. And he has not been able to really address that as yet. So where this is all going to go, I have no idea. But it's a party in disarray and it's a mess. And every now and then people look fondly back at the Nelson Mandela days, right? Because he himself was not corrupt. Yes?
Let's talk about the family farms and small farms in Africa. And I understand the water level is going down considerably and so corporations down several hundred feet to get water. And you say that these infrastructures have to be bought big
Yeah, well, to repeat the question, small farms don't have access to water. They can't drain the water out of the wells or the groundwater anymore because the water level has gone down so radically. That is true almost everywhere in the world right now, but it's particularly bad in Africa. And only, corporations can come in with big machinery to dig wells deep enough, but at some point even that runs out. So that is one issue. The water issue is catastrophic in Africa. It is even more, if not, I think even more catastrophic in India right now. And it is increasingly problematic in other parts of the world because it's a combination of too many people using water and the climate change issue, right, which dries out sources of water. And when you start, and it's true in the Salinas Valley, where they went deeper and deeper into the groundwater, and the ground started sinking right here in the Salinas Valley. You don't even have to go to Africa, right? So that's a huge problem, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. And people, of course, are talking about desalinization, which is very expensive, seeding clouds, which is very expensive. The ice in the Antarctic and in the Arctic and Greenland is falling into the ocean. Well, maybe some of that water can be harnessed. I mean, you know, I can just spin here all the various suggestions, but we're in a serious mess here. And most governments are not addressing it in a timely fashion, including our own. Now, the other part of your question had to do with seeds. Almost everywhere in the world, the way to deal with drought, and also independently and overlappingly, the way to deal with the need to produce more food on more limited land, is to, in fact, change the particular plants and what they're capable of doing, meaning growing more for harvest, using less water, often using fewer additives of one kind or another. So for the last 50, 60 years, there have been groups actually funded by the World Bank and the Ford Foundation, which have started to study the main sustenance seed stuff around the world. There's a rice center in the Philippines. The wheat center is in Mexico. The tropical food, fruits and vegetables sector is in Ibadan in Nigeria, and so on down. And so agronomists, scientists of various kinds, have been studying how you increase, let's say, rice production, which is not necessarily the mainstay of Africa, but in many African societies, rice is the mainstay of their diet. Rice, not only how you increase rice production, but how you make rice more nutritious, so that when people have limited access to nutritional food, they can access it through more nutritional foods that they normally eat. All right? So the first research used to be not just how to grow more and without water, but how to grow more nutritional food. Because if you recall, until the 1950s, people were in fact dying around the world from hunger. Nowadays, for the since most of us have been adults, people only perish from hunger because they were poor, not because there was a world food shortage. And we're now moving into a cycle where we could have a world food shortage and famine again. Famine is different than there not being adequate food supply in the world. Okay, so scientists are concerned about three things. One, potential famine, not enough food to feed the population in the world when it gets up to 10 billion people. They are concerned about producing food which is nutritionally helpful in making people healthy, right? And they're also looking at how you can continue to grow food you've always been growing under new conditions of climate and water. Those are all out there in research land. There are many labs and so forth. Now, what you mentioned was Monsanto, which of course is one of the major corporate nasty outfits which produces seeds, which makes you buy expensive seeds. Some of them are environmentally not helpful and so forth. But that's not the only thing that's going on. That is to say, scientists are trying to get breakthroughs in the kind of food production that you might have. Apart from that, or separate from that, is the research that has to do with attacks on food production by worms, beetles, insects of different kinds, which reduce the productive capacity of a field of corn or whatever. And that is a whole another kind of research things. And it used to be in the 40s, 50s, 60s that the way to deal with that was to throw fertilizers of various kinds, chemicals onto the thing, which would be kill the bugs or not make the particular product hospitable to bugs, and you would, increase your productivity. Starting in the 60s, and actually starting as well in African labs in Kenya, you had research into how you can immunize plants from being attacked by these vermin of various kinds. And the way, what they started doing was doing cell research of various ways to neuter the bugs that would attack so the bugs couldn't reproduce as fast. So much of the research was not let's throw chemicals at this problem, but how can you tinker with the biology of things that attack plants in such a way that you reduce the number of flies, bugs, whatever the particular thing is that attacks plants in a place. And that has moved forward quite a bit. You now can buy seeds that foster the neutering of the bug as it attacks the plant. Right? That's how sophisticated it's become. But you also, Well, if you have the money, this is true. But on the other hand, insofar as governments in a lot of African countries deploy money for agriculture, they in fact deploy a fair amount to that effect. And then you have all these organizations, UN and Food and Agriculture and so forth, which are plowing in money as well. So that it's not true that only the farmers in Iowa can avail themselves of reducing the various plagues onto their products, but quite a lot of progress has been made, and some of it is not even that expensive. That is to say, when you prevent some bug from reproducing, once they stop reproducing, you essentially knock out a very large percentage of that particular species, right? So it's an investment up front, but you don't necessarily have to keep reinvesting. So I'm not saying that it's not helpful to be rich or to have money, but I'm saying it's not as a hopeless situation, and it's being attacked from various directions, biological directions in terms of production, seed directions, all kinds of directions. And you'd be surprised how many African farmers have access to improved quality of growing their products. It's not as grim a picture as we sometimes make it out to be. Have we exhausted this topic? Yeah.
In the vast continent, with probably 50 countries, is there a common language? Do they use English? Do they use French?
Good question. So almost every country on the African continent is multilingual in terms of its ethnic languages. There are for example, Somalia is not multilingual. Everybody speaks Somali in Somalia. It's a language there, and that's the only language. But almost every country is multi-ethnic and multi-different languages. During colonialism, superimposed on that were the colonial languages. So either English or French or Portuguese, by and large. And the elite learned those languages in school, and they spoke them and so forth. At the point of independence, people had to make a decision. And the decision that some countries made was the same decision which, by the way, India made. India has hundreds of millions of people speaking this language and that language, and they decided that the official government language should be English, because they thought that it was a way to keep the country together, that it made a sense to keep the country together, not fall apart by having a common language. So some African countries made that decision to have a common language which was the colonial language, right? That didn't mean that people didn't also learn their ethnic languages. For example, in Ghana, after independence, Ghana became independent in 1957, they kept English as the language in school, but they did whatever the local ethnic language was in the first few grades of elementary school and then phased it in, and by the time people got to high school and university, everything was in English. Right, so that they made sure that people also has access to the ethnic language, but then built English into it. There are some exceptions, and one of the key exceptions is a language called Swahili. Swahili is not the indigenous language of any ethnic group on the African continent. Swahili is a real language. It was developed over time using a combination of Arabic and local languages because Arab traders came down the coast of East Africa and they needed some kind of common trading language. And so this language developed over some time to become a real language, a language with an alphabet and with grammar and all the rest of it. Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, translated most of Shakespeare into Swahili and things like that. And some countries, Tanzania in particular, decided we have so many little ethnic groups, we don't have 2 or 3 major ethnic groups, that rather than messing with all these little languages, and rather than superimposing the colonial language, which is English, why don't we make the governmental formal language Swahili? So in Tanzania, at the time of independence, they decided that Swahili was going to be the national language. In Kenya, they decided English and Swahili. In Uganda, English to some extent and Swahili. In parts of the Congo, French and some Swahili. So many people in East Africa speak Swahili in addition to whatever their ethnic language might be. Some are entirely Swahili speakers. They're urban teenagers, university students who only have sort of some kitchen knowledge, like, immigrants' children have some kitchen knowledge of whatever the language is, but basically are English speakers, right? You run into a lot of Hispanics kids around the university in here. Well, I speak Spanish, but actually they don't know a lot of Spanish. They can't really write it and they don't read it much, but they have some family Spanish, right? And then they go to university and they formally study Spanish. Spanish as a on top of their language. So you have some of that. So you have almost all Swahili speakers. Now there's one equivalent to Swahili which hasn't worked as well as a common language, and that is Hausa. And Hausa, Hausa. And Hausa was the trading language in the Sahara region. So the Sahara countries and Niger, Chad, all those countries, and northern Nigeria, and all those people speak Hausa. Now, Hausa was actually an ethnic group, and the Hausa language built on that ethnic language and superimposed some trading language, so they also have some Arabic and stuff in it. But since Saharan trade did not really continue in the same way in modern times, there are now some Hausa-speaking people that live in the north of those countries, but the citizens of the rest of the countries, for example, everybody south of northern Nigeria doesn't speak Hausa. It's an alien language. So it has, unlike Swahili, it hasn't taken root as a kind of major African international language, but for a historical period it did, and it's still the ethnic language of some people. All right, so next time, China and the Far East in general. Lots going on internationally. See you in November, I guess.